A reading from the letter to the Hebrews. Brothers and sisters, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us, and persevere in running the race that lies before us, while keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the leader and perfecter of faith. For the sake of the joy that lay before him, Jesus endured the cross, despising its shame, and has taken his seat at the right of the throne of God. Consider how he endured such opposition from sinners, in order that you may not grow weary and lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. The word of the Lord.
Responsorial Psalm. The response is, they will praise you, Lord, who long for you. I will fulfill my vows before those who fear him. The lowly shall eat their fill. They who seek the Lord shall praise him. May your hearts be ever merry. They will praise you, Lord, who long for you. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations shall bow down before him. To him alone shall bow down all who sleep in the earth. Before him shall bend all who go down into the dust. They will praise you, Lord, who long for you. And to him my soul shall live. My descendants shall serve him. Let the coming generation be told of the Lord, that they may proclaim to a people yet to be born the justice he has shown. They will praise you, Lord, who long for you.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors, and had spent all that she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. And the woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this, and said that she should be given something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
January 31st, the Memorial of St. John Bosco. The first reading comes from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 1 to 4. The author of this letter speaks about how we're surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. Now this is both those people who give witness to the faith here on earth, but also those who have triumphed, who have given witness during their lives and now are with God in heaven. That cloud of witnesses tells us that we should be faithful to what we have promised. And likewise, we have the example of Jesus, who is faithful. He is the leader and perfecter of faith. Now it's interesting, he's the perfecter of faith. He is the one who makes our faith perfect. But remember, being made perfect in the Old Testament meant becoming a priest. In Jesus, our great high priest, we too share his priesthood. He endured the cross, and he gave us an example of what it means to live and die for the faith. We should do likewise. And this is typical of the letter to the Hebrews. It gives some dogmatic teaching, but then almost immediately after, there's a moral teaching. And so the dogmatic teaching, this is who Jesus is. The moral teaching, we should follow his example. The Gospel is from Mark 5, 21 to 43. Jesus reaches the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and he's met by a synagogue official named Jairus. Jairus begs Jesus to come and heal his daughter who's at the point of death. Well, Jesus goes off to do that, and while he's on the way, a woman with a hemorrhage touches him. Now, first of all, a woman with a hemorrhage probably means the menstrual flow, and she's been suffering from an unusual menstrual flow for 12 years. That meant that she was alienated from her own family. She couldn't eat with them, she couldn't pray with them, because she was considered unclean. Being unclean, she should have never touched Jesus, because technically that made him unclean too. But because of her faith, she was made clean. Instead of causing greater uncleanliness, this act of faith has brought greater healing. Jesus feels the power go out, and it's a very primitive way of saying it. It sounds almost as if it were a spark of static electricity. It's not so much Jesus who caused the miracle, but the woman's faith. And in fact, Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has saved you." Notice, your faith has saved you, not healed you. In the gospel, when there is an expression of faith, the person is saved because they're healed not only physically but also spiritually. And after the woman touches him, Jesus looks around in the crowd to see who touched him. In the Gospel of Luke, it says that he looked around to look at the woman who touched him. He knows everything in Luke. In Mark, he doesn't seem to know who touched him. And that's typical of the Gospel of Mark. In Mark, Jesus is seen as much more human, much more dusty for the journey in which he's engaged. After this episode, Jesus continues on his way, and this technique, starting a story, putting another story in the middle, and then going back to the first story, is typical of the Gospel of Mark. He does this very often. He arrives, and the girl is already dead. In fact, the mourners are outside, and Jesus says she's not dead, she's just asleep, and they begin to laugh. These mourners are not family members, they're probably paid professionals. They're paid to cry. Because this was a synagogue official's daughter, the funeral has to be of a certain grandeur. Jesus takes in Peter, James, and John, the three who accompany Jesus whenever something rather important is happening. Remember, they're at the Transfiguration too. And he says, "Little girl, get up. Talitha kum." And in fact, the girl who's 12 years old arises, and Jesus says, "Give her something to eat." And notice that human touch. Give her something to eat. That he cares for her in a very compassionate way. So here we see two miracles. We see the miracle of the healing of the woman with a hemorrhage, and the greater healing, somebody's brought back to life. Now the daughter of Jairus is not resurrected. She's reanimated. The difference is resurrection means that one receives a glorified body and would never die again. This girl is only reanimated, brought back to life, so that she doesn't have a glorified body. One day she would die again. And may God bless us.